Welcome to Module 4 of the Telecare Peterborough Volunteer Training. We're going to begin today with an overview of anger, which is really a natural instinctive response to threats that we feel. Now, it can be a real threat or a perceived threat. Typically, anger is rooted in pain or fear. It feels powerful and protective to be angry, whereas feeling pain or fear is more vulnerable. So anger steps in as a defensive reaction. It enables us often to take action where pain or fear sometimes immobilize us and have us feeling helpless. Anger is an active emotion that moves us forward sometimes. Anger, though, can be out of control, and so there are a few things we want to keep in mind in terms of managing anger. Um, when we're dealing with anger, we want people who are angry to have self awareness and an understanding of why they're angry. What's happened to bring them to this place? Do they have hurt feelings? Are they afraid for something? It helps to be curious and compassionate. So, curiosity is really just, again, seeking that understanding. And compassionate means being accepting and non judgmental about where that emotion comes from. Focusing on the problems and solutions can help with anger. When we focus on the reason why we're angry, we're less able to move forward sometimes. If we focus on what is the problem and how can we fix it, how can we move forward, what are our solutions, that can help us with managing anger as well. It's very helpful when feeling angry to avoid blaming or shaming, because that really only aggravates situations and upsets people. When you're talking with someone who's angry on the phone, there are some things that I want you to remember. It's most important for you to stay calm and remain neutral. Don't try to take a side or engage them in argument. Don't try to convince them of things or try to get them to calm down. Just try not to take anything personally. Remember that their anger, even if they're venting it on you, doesn't have anything to do with you. Even if they are saying it's your response that's upsetting them, there's something going on inside them, and you're just a convenient target because you answered the phone. Listen quietly without trying to calm them down right away. Sometimes when people are angry, they need just the space to say what they're angry about and talk about it for a little while. And then that kind of takes the wind out of their sails and lets them have space for other feelings as well. As I mentioned earlier, avoid arguing with them. Don't antagonize them. You don't have to convince a caller of anything. That's not your responsibility. Just being there and giving them space to vent the feeling is enough. And then you can validate their feelings. You do not have to agree with the facts of what they're saying to be able to validate their feelings. Because when we validate people's feelings, we say things like, "It sounds like that's very upsetting for you," or "that makes you so angry." Use their words when you validate their feelings, and try to repeat back to them what they're feeling. Hold the boundaries that you have set for yourself and that Telecare sets for you as well. They are not allowed to swear at you or call you names or make threats towards you. You do not have to tolerate abusive behavior just because someone is angry about their situation. From anger, I want to move into talking a little bit about family violence, although we also have a wonderful guest speaker who's going to talk to us about family violence and abuse. The definition of family violence is really any form of abuse or neglect that a child or adult experiences from a family member or from someone with whom they have an intimate relationship. It's an abuse of power by one person, and it's aimed to hurt or control someone who trusts and depends on them. And this link for the Canada website, Health Promotion Stop Family Violence, will have a lot more information about that. This is where this definition comes from. It'll be on the blackboard and you'll be able to follow the link and get more information. While there's no specific offense for family violence in the criminal code, most acts of family violence are crimes in Canada. So there's a list of crimes here that you can see range from criminal harassment all the way to homicide. And if you look at the Justice of the Government Canada Justice website, that will also show you some more detail about how that is applied in the criminal code. There are lots of names that family violence also goes by. Sometimes we call it dating violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, violence against women, gender-based violence, child abuse, child maltreatment, elder abuse. When we think about it, whatever we call it, it's about power and control dynamics in relationships. And so when we visit this website called the Hope Harbor Home, they have these tools here that I'd like to share with people when I talk about family violence. They have the power and control wheel, which, as you can see, has several sections in it, and each section is an area of an intimate relationship or a close family relationship, and it talks about how power and control can be abused in a relationship, leading to violence. And over here we have the equality wheel, and we can see that the equality wheel has corresponding sections. And in these sections, the equality wheel offers us information about what a healthy relationship looks like with no violence. So I invite you to visit this site, or even to just Google the power and control and equality wheels, and take a look at those sections a little bit more closely and see, what you think about what fits into a healthy relationship, or what might be a sign that there is a power imbalance and possible abuse in a non-healthy relationship. Keeping in mind that no relationship is fully 100% in either one of these spectrums. We also have a guest speaker coming to speak specifically about elder abuse, keeping in mind that we can see seniors abused physically, emotionally, financially, neglected, abandoned, and sexually abused in many different ways by people that they are relying on to provide care for them. Essentially, people who are at risk are older adults with no family or friends nearby, people with disabilities, memory problems, or dementia, those who depend on others for help with the activities of daily living. So if someone can't eat, bathe, or dress themselves, then they're much more vulnerable to someone abusing them. More women than men are victims. And you will find on the Blackboard website this help guide as well that has articles about elder abuse and elder neglect. I have a series of TED Talks that will also be available on the Blackboard, Module 4, that talk about violence. And so, for example, why we get mad and why it's healthy, how childhood trauma affects health across a lifetime, why domestic violence don't leave, victims of domestic violence don't leave. These topics can be quite challenging, particularly if you have any issues and stresses in your own background. And so I invite you once again to just take your time, watch the TED Talks at your own pace, and do things to take care of yourself and bring you some comfort, ease, and soothing in between watching them. I also have a video I'm going to put up about attachment theory and how childhood affects our whole life, the kinds of relationships and the attachments we have or don't have in childhood affect us lifelong. So that brings me to talking about trauma. I want to spend some time talking to you about trauma because many of the people who call the line will have experienced some sort of trauma in their life, because most of us have experienced some sort of trauma in our life. And trauma is really an emotional response to a terrible event that causes or is perceived to cause a physical or emotional threat. And so I want to make a note that it doesn't have to cause an actual threat. If someone believes that there is a real and present threat, trauma can happen. So there are different types of trauma. when we talk about acute trauma, what we mean is something that happens after a single stressor or dangerous event. So you could have a car accident and have acute trauma immediately after the car accident. Chronic trauma happens, on the other hand, after repeated or prolonged exposure to highly stressful events. And so that might be someone who's abused as a child or bullied or experiences domestic violence, or someone who does a high trauma job, like first responders. They also can experience the harm caused by repeated exposure, right? When we think about complex trauma, we are talking about exposure to multiple different traumatic events over time. And I want to stress here that what we perceive to be traumatic might be very different from what someone else perceives to be traumatic. And so we're listening to the person and asking, how did they feel about events? And sometimes when we think they should experience trauma, they may not, because that's part of their normal experience. And other times when something we think isn't a very big deal causes someone else trauma, it's often because of their perceived experience of it, or else its association with another traumatic event in their history. So the new event, even though it was less traumatic, is linked to that initial traumatic event. Vicarious trauma happens when we're exposed to other people's trauma over and over again. And so that can happen, honestly, it can happen by reading horror novels or watching crime shows as much as it can happen, except that those fictions typically are a little bit less traumatic because we know that they are made up for movies and books. Whereas when we do this work, and when you take call after call listening to other people's terrible stories of what's happened to them, it can impact you. You can have symptoms of trauma yourself. And that's one of the reasons why we talked so much about resilience and self-care, in Module 2. That was a really important conversation, because resilience and self-care is important for all people, and especially perhaps people who are doing jobs that expose them to trauma on purpose regularly. There is a video that I'm going to post on Blackboard about trauma in the brain, and it's a really good explanation, pretty simple but solid explanation of what happens to the brain when a traumatic event occurs and how we respond. It's really important to me that people understand that when someone experiences something that is traumatic for them, the brain responds automatically. It's a biological imperative that there will be a trauma response. And it doesn't matter how strong or how tough or how experienced or skilled a person is, their body and brain will react that way. And then what happens is how they recover comes back to what are their skills, their strengths, the resources they have access to. So everybody has post-traumatic stress, and whether it becomes a disorder is really based on an individual's what they receive in the recovery process. There's also this experience of post-traumatic growth that we're learning more about as they research it. Post-traumatic stress doesn't always lead to more problems and disorders. Sometimes it leads to growth and new life. Tanya Glenn in 2017 in her book talked about 4 different types of stress. She talked about acute stress, which happens within 24 hours of an incident. And that's really what I talked about when I said post-traumatic stress is a biological imperative, because it's the adrenaline, the cortisol that are rushing through the body that trigger this response in an acute way. Now, sometimes we can have delayed stress where that acute symptoms, the acute symptoms show up days, weeks, or months after the event, because in the initial aftermath of the event, there's so much shock that people are numb for a period of time. And then, weeks later, they start to experience those acute symptoms, and they don't know where it's coming from. And this would explain why. Cumulative stress happens. We also call that burnout, where you have layer upon layer of stress over time, and your system just gets overwhelmed with trying to cope with all the stress. Post traumatic stress happens after exposure to an extreme event, and post traumatic stress is related to symptoms like re experiencing the event through flashbacks or nightmares and having continual acute stress symptoms. So those acute stress symptoms, when they happen right after an incident, will gradually decline when a person gets the right support, and even the delayed response will gradually decline if they get the right support when that delayed stress response happens. And Post-traumatic stress can often cause an ongoing experience of those acute stress symptoms, and that needs also the right kind of attention and support in order to help a person move through it and reduce those symptoms. Glenn also talked about two types of internal experiences of stress. So she talked about something called psychic battering, where we get the wear and tear of repeated exposure to traumatic situations over time. And she talked about getting stuck in a moment, focusing on what went wrong during a traumatic incident, and ruminating on self blame and self doubt. So it's important to understand both of these possibilities. If someone has experienced a traumatic incident, then they might get stuck in the moment and think about only what they didn't do when in fact they did lots of good things, or they did the best they could in the moment and they didn't know what else to do. And they'll get stuck there, and we want to think about how can we help them be compassionate with themselves for whatever happened, and to put ownership where it belongs. And sometimes that's tricky to help people untangle the threads of an incident, and move to become unstuck. Yeah, we want to be just mindful of these types of internal stresses that people have when they've been in situations of experiencing trauma, whether it's a little bits of trauma over a lot of time or a particular trauma they're stuck in. Self-awareness is really important when it comes to managing trauma. People do better when they have a sense of self-awareness of their feelings, their actions and reactions. So they're paying attention to, what sets off these responses in them. How can they minimize that? It's important for people to have an ability to know how they cope with anger, hurt, and resentment, right? So this is true for callers. We're gonna ask them questions about their feelings and how they're reacting. We're gonna ask them how they're coping with their feelings of anger, hurt, and resentment. But it's also true for us in terms of managing our own experience of trauma and thinking about how we deal with these things. It can be helpful to understand that there are dynamics from the past that have influences in the present. And there's a TED Talk that I'm going to link in the Blackboard Module 4 section that talks about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and how traumatic experiences in the past influence us through our whole life, and how we just being aware of that helps us be sometimes gentler with ourselves when we are moving through the feelings and thoughts that we experience in a moment. It's important to be aware of your own stress signals as well. For example, what are the signs and symptoms that you're starting to get distressed? For me, what happens is I start to feel tension in the back of my neck. My shoulders start to rise up closer to my ears. I may notice my hands making fists, and if I'm really paying attention, I'll also notice that my breathing is more shallow and my chest feels tight. And for me, when I start to feel those things, then I'm likely to get irritable, right? So I kind of know my pattern at this point in my life. And so I would invite you to take a moment and just consider your own stress signals. Do you feel the stress in your head, your neck and shoulders, in your belly, in your gut, in your knees, right? Where do you feel those initial symptoms? And being aware of that can help us notice sooner what is happening for us and help us, take care of ourselves sooner. This is something that we can also help other people understand when they call us. We can certainly be talking to them about, where do they feel this stress? What's happening in their body? Are they having headaches or tension or an upset stomach, etc.? It's also helpful when we think about trauma recovery to think about the idea of how we sabotage our self care. And so when people are talking to you and you are sharing ideas that they can do to take care of themselves, listen for those reasons they have not to take care of themselves. I have 4 children, and for about 7 years, my father in law lived with us with his dementia diagnosis as he declined. And with 6 other people in the house to look after, I could pretty much sabotage my self care at the drop of a hat because there was always somebody else who needed something and preferred that need be met by me. So, are people, full time caregivers? Are they people pleasers? Are they, trying to control everything? And so those kind of habits get in the way of their self care, right? What are the kinds of things people are doing that interfere with taking care of themselves and feeling better? And also, what are the sources of traumatic stress? Um, sometimes it's a incident that they've experienced, but sometimes they're taking in trauma from other sources as well, like I mentioned horror novels, or I mentioned true crime shows, or those lots. There's lots of TV shows now about first responders jobs that cover pretty traumatic experiences. Um, Even something like Grey's Anatomy covered quite a bit of traumatic experience. What are the trends in terms of those kind of forms of, what we call entertainment, right? I guess. Um, Keeping in mind that all of these factors of self awareness are good, both to ask the caller about, but also to keep in mind for your own wellness over time and your own recovery from difficult incidents that you experience. And so Martin talked about 4 R's of resilience after crisis, and that's where I'm going to leave this talk off for today. Um, Expect to have a reaction if there's a crisis. Okay, that's so important because so many times we think we shouldn't have a reaction, and it's not possible. We're humans and we have lots of neurobiological functions that cause us to react because those things like the fight, flight, or freeze response are what has kept us alive as a species. So expect a reaction if there's a crisis incident. And then begin the process of returning to typical functioning recovery. So, yes, you have an incident and you have the reaction, but then you begin the recovery. You are reorienting yourself in the world by adapting to the experience and the new knowledge you have, right? So, if you have an experience and it's a close call, then you are going to do something differently in that situation the next time. And I mean, that can be healthy. That's how we learn. It can also be something that is perhaps even a bit more reactive than we need to be. So we want to be paying attention as we reorient to the new knowledge that we have, that we're not becoming hypervigilant in a way that's going to cause us some more harm. And finally, talking about renewal as a growth trajectory. How do we make meaning and find purpose after a crisis? And so, again, I invite you to think about this from the perspective of the caller. How do you help them understand that their reaction to an incident was normal? How do you help them look for ways to recover and return to their level of functioning? How do you help them adapt to the experience and understand what to do with this knowledge they now have about something in the world that they didn't know before this incident? And how do you help them identify what their meaning is and their purpose in life after this incident, this crisis that they've had? And so these are some of the things that can be helpful to keep in mind when you're talking to someone who's experiencing a really difficult situation or just experienced a traumatic event. All right. That's it for Module 4's narrated slideshow. I'll look forward to chatting again online in class this week.